Welcome to Close Listening, Pen Sound's program of readings and conversations with poets. On today's show, recorded at the Arts Cafe at the Kelly Writers House of the University of Pennsylvania, Michael Palmer talks with me. You can hear his reading from just before this conversation on Palmer's Pen Sound page. Michael Palmer's most recent books, all from New Directions, are The Language of the Sphinx, 2015, some of which he read in that reading just now, Thread, 2011, Company of Moths, 2005, Codes Appearing, which collects notes from Echo Lake, First Figure and Son from 1979 to 1988, was published in 2011. A collection of his essays, Active Boundaries, is from 2008. He lives in San Francisco, where he frequently works with the Margaret Jenkins Dance Company. Michael, welcome to Close Listening.
Thank you.
Now, how long have you been talking to Arto?
Well, our first conversations were in the late 40s. He was to have done with the Judgment of God about that time, and I was 3 or 4, and we started having our first conversations around then. And I really don't recall much about them, and I was a little intimidated by his figures of speech, which were somewhat outside the norm.
So do you make it a regular practice of talking to dead people?
Only when I feel like barking and howling.
In the first set of poems that you read, the newer poems in the reading, you called them elegies.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about those poems, where they came from, what the process of writing them was, some of the references in them, just a kind of a secondary texture around the poems, as well, of course, as the question that you raised when you introduced it as to what elegy could be. Obviously, elegy to some degree is about the dead, talking to the dead, listening.
Yeah, and to some degree, it's a form of mourning in a way. In this case, partly generalized, but for some of the circumstances we find ourselves in this republic of ours. The figure Sister Satan is the principal creature addressed, who kind of, I don't want to say too much about her. She is a lover of mine, secret lover of mine, and from the dark side. But actually, she's someone who arose in the work before that sequence, and she became a figure of the imagination for me, a certain other, who was at once a figure of perhaps dark erotic attraction, but also somewhat comic attraction as well, like Sister Sadie or what have you, almost a comic book figure in a certain way. But I found that addressing her in the poems opened a form of speech not entirely new to my work, but one that was somewhat liberating in terms of turning it into a conversation. You and I had talked about Edmond Jabez, and of course conversation was essential to Edmond. It was an overcoming of dictatorial speech, the one-way speech of command and obedience. And that's always been important for me as part of a model of poetic behavior, that it was not one way, but that it was a conversation with an imaginary other or others. And Sister Satan is the latest embodiment of that in a way.
A lot of your work can be thought of as conversations with poets from the past.
Absolutely, yeah.
And yet, in many ways, you turn against a more canonical idea of who those poets are and what your relationship to them is.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Yes, I mean, obviously, poets continue to speak beyond the tomb, beyond the grave, if they're lucky, if we're lucky. And so we, as poets, almost all of us enter into conversation with them in an odd way, as if they're our contemporaries, and they enrich our speech, and they say things through our mouths in ways that are sometimes surprising. And I think we've always have some yearning for what would have been like to know so-and-so and to be able to converse about this odd, indefinable art. So they have an odd living presence. And I think our work, Louis Zukowski once said, poetry is like a hummingbird. It must go forward, sometimes backwards. And I think it very much does that, always in motion, never referring to some dead tradition, but referring to the whole range of voices among our contemporaries and among those who have gone.
Not your earliest, but one of the earlier versions of this is the Baudelaire series.
Yeah.
So how does Baudelaire figure in your cosmology of poetics?
He always interested me as a very young writer. And then I returned to him, I think, when I started seriously reading Walter Benjamin, and Benjamin's articulation of Baudelaire as the source, in a way, of contemporary lyric, the kind of analytic and against the grain lyricism that interests me. Not to say that Baudelaire himself was purely a lyric poet, by no means was he, though a lot of his work is set to music, of course. But his chiaroscuro really set part of the tone of the modernist and contemporary relationship to society, if you will. I think it would have been without that body of work, for me, things would have been different. So he brought in a tone that, without becoming obviously Baudelairean, allowed a certain critical relationship to society that could also have a component of musicality that was important.
So, thinking of musicality and the lyric, you use the expression analytic lyric, what I sometimes call a sprung lyric. So lyric that's not centered around a voice. It's not exactly self-expression, at least not in the sense of confessional poetry that you turned away from. If you were ever turned toward it, I don't know.
No, I wasn't ever turned toward it,
but
rejected
I turned away
anyway.
as a young person. But these terms, lyric, voice, expression, voices, anti-lyric, analytic lyric, hover around your work in a more than incidental way. They're not background; they're actually the subject of the prosody. They may be not the subject matter per se, but certainly they constantly come up in the way that you cut the line, the way you torque constantly. I mean, I think that was McCaffrey's term in that early essay about the constant torquing in your work. If you're going some way and then it spins, but still the music comes off of the spinning away from, kind of, I guess, centrifugal aspects, which I think is actually, still present in the newest poems you read tonight. But how do you see the relation of that work to questions of expression, voice, voicing, and the lyric?
Well, of course, the lyric is properly problematized in our time, or in any time. I remember wandering around the outskirts of Paris with Emmanuel Ocar many, many years ago. And Emmanuel said, we have to be very cautious because there are bands of lyric poets roaming the streets. And in that sense, the thing one had to avoid in approaching this density of musicality, however we think of it, in relation to meaning, of course. One of the things about a dense musicality is it allows the poem to speak for itself to some degree. It gets the bells start ringing and odd sounds come out. But of course, conventional lyric is the stuff of ordinary magazine verse and saccharine emotion, and so we have to work against the pseudo model of a poetry that is endlessly consolatory and sweet. But I didn't want to give up the density that lyric, such as the lyric of Sappho or what have you, offers. And so I was caught in a funny kind of practical quandary in that regard of not wanting to give up the what was available, but at the same time having danger signs along the way. And in the greatest of our contemporary practice of what we call the lyric or analytic lyric, a kind of philosophical thought, and this is another thing that Adorno actually addresses in a certain way, is very much present. A concentrated interior lyricism, Celan in his case. And Celan is a lyric poet out of a lyric expressionist German tradition, to speak somewhat crudely. Adorno himself talked about the almost dialectical character of that kind of critical relationship to normative practice and normative speech and normative ideology.
Chris Mostassa, who you met earlier today, my associate here on Penn Sound, asked the perfect close listening question, but it relates very much to what you're talking about here, music and lyric. He noticed that you used the term unlistening and was fascinated by this term, which I never had noticed before. Memory is a kindness, a kind of unlistening, a gray wall even toward which you move, a kind of straight gray wall beside which they walk, she the older by a dozen years. He carefully unlistening.
Early.
Sign that empties, that is, he would ask her, he would be the asker, and she unlistening.
Yes, I mean, I think I was trying in my own jagged way at that time, in that very early work, to address an alternative form of hearing, if you will, an overhearing that sometimes comes in conversation, so that if you unlisten in conversation, you unlisten when address comes forward, you hear the overtones of that address, or undertones, if you will, the emotional undertones that are another form of conversation, sometimes contradicting, sometimes enhancing the actual dialogue, the actual referential meaning of the words. There's so much beyond the, quote, literal referential meaning that is in conversation. And I think you have to turn aside a little bit to hear the rest of it. Just as you have to become blind to certain things around you to see certain things, even if you're looking at art, but looking at the world.
So shifts of frame and attention.
Yeah, and a letting go of what one thinks of as one's interpretive skills and so on.
Barth makes the distinction between hearing and listening. Normally one would think in a more traditional liberal context that what you want to do is to listen. Why aren't you listening to me? But actually it's hearing, from my point of view, that you want to do, that the listening obliterates hearing.
Yeah. At times I think it does that with Barth. Yeah.
There's always a tension in our work between politics and aesthetics, or between any of us as citizens in dark times, as they've been all these years. It's something that you have a very continuous address to, how the political, and I don't mean the social, I mean political in the macro-political sense.
Yeah.
All that we've talked about is about politics, for example, the politics of hearing versus listening. But I mean the macro-political issue, Trump right now, the Vietnam War, when we were younger.
Yeah, and when I was younger than that, the McCarthy era, when I was very young, but that was the first revelatory moment when I watched the Army McCarthy hearings, and of course, these were people who were Trump's heroes.
Yeah, Roy Cohn. It's his. Roy Cohn speaks to Trump the way Artaud speaks to you.
That's right. That's right. And what that says about both of us, I don't know.
But how can you? What is the dance? What is the articulation of these I'm saying macro. It's a somewhat unpleasant word, but I mean the way the hot button political issues of the moment, as people understand it within the larger public discussion, and poems, such as anti-war poems, poems that address the catastrophe for the environment, or the 1%, the obscene economic disparity of, or as in famous lines of yours, napalm, what it means for our country to napalm people, which we never come outside of. How can you bring those kinds of references into a poem, and what tension is there with the aesthetic of the poem as developing? I mean, you're saying the poem isn't something, in Crilly's sense, you don't have an idea, a message, and this is Levertov Duncan, and then you're going to put that into words, even though you might have a whole set of sentiments around the issues I said. Something else is going on. You don't quite know what's going to go on because you're writing the poem. How does that work in a political context for you?
It's of course a very tricky and problematic to articulate that. I mean, I don't write instrumental poems, whether it's workers throw off your chains or what have you. I have always felt that those messages were better articulated in other media. I'm happy to do so marching in the streets, but although I'm getting too old to march in the streets, it seems. The atmosphere of the darkness of all of that inevitably sculpts the territory of the poem. And so we have this, I don't have to force a message into a poem, I think, to paint a certain kind of picture about inhabiting this moment, its darkness and its light, without recourse to sounding like an essay in the Nation or something like that, or a very bad poem in the Nation or what have you. And yet at the same time, I want the reality of our time certainly to come through, but I want it to come through also not as just a reality of this is January such and such and such and such is happening, but of these realities tend to be eternal. And in that sense, I don't go fully with Duncan in his problem with Denise, but at the same time, I am sympathetic to the fact that he sees the larger character of good versus evil as something that the poem addresses without a full self-righteousness of I have the right answer here, but addresses in terms of this agon, this endless conflict, which at the present we are losing rather badly. So I'm wary of simply message poetry. I think the problem is if there's a certain urgency, depending on your character, that says, "Oh, I'm going to do a message poem. I'm going to incite people to action." But those poems tend to be infected by the language of the enemy in a certain way, and they tend to have a factor of decay that's very swift. If you want to find out, just read poetry from the new masses in the 1930s. And so you become an enemy of poetry often, and an enemy of the actual message that you're hoping to convey. Now, I think there is great political poetry that we can think of as political sometimes. And depending, again, on your social circumstance, and depending on, I mean, the African American community is going to speak to this in a very different way than I will, and with different needs. Some of the African American, I don't mean to generalize, obviously, but there's such a different relationship to reality in the streets and so on, and to experience, just as there is a dramatically different relationship, as we referred to before, of our day-to-day lives vis-a-vis, for example, the lives of the poets under the Soviet system, and even our contemporaries under the post-Soviet system, where the relationships are, the entanglements are experienced differently. And so the judgments occur in different ways. And of course, many of my Russian and Ukrainian and other friends juggle with this question in a very interesting way. And they have faced tyranny and they have faced abject behavior. It doesn't mean that they're going to just write. They can't stand the commonplace reaction to that of lousy poetry. But they see under the sign of eternity, if you will, the reality of the day-to-day problematic. And they have an audience that is determined enough to read at various levels that, and who take for granted the, if you will, serious play of the poem, that they will understand. So you don't have to be totally simplistic for and driven by a single goal in poetry for people to know what the hell is going on, you know, what's going down.
You are hearing Michael Palmer on Penn Sounds, Close Listening. I guess related to that would be the kind of Cold War origin distinction between the raw and the cooked process and product, two different orientations in American poetry and poetics. Nowadays, there's a movement to try to shame those who believe that there are these two sides.
Yeah.
And as somebody who's not really susceptible to shame, I feel no guilt at all about this. But a lot of people, take this shaming seriously.
Yeah.
About the lyric and so on. What is your sense about that distinction? It sort of comes out of the new American poetry versus the more mainstream poetry practice in the 50s and 60s, but still persists in 2018.
Yeah, I think that we're on the cooked thing, as partly articulated by Lowell, is a very primitive understanding of the nature of poetic practice. Like, it's got to be raw or it's got to be cooked. You can't. That's absurd. And so Lowell was looking out from the walls of academe. I don't want to sound too. Yes, I do. At the unwashed hordes out there, writing free verse and other unspeakable things. And I mean, he changed over time too, but and making this stupid distinction, as if people who are practicing, let's say, non-metrical verse were not trying to master the craft and understand the history of the art and so on. And so it was a very feeble distinction, I think, and remains so. I remember once a professor, a young friend, this is when we were first living in San Francisco, he came to visit, and he was studying at some college in the Boston area. And he was curious about my work, and he said, well, my professor says that he is a follower of Wallace Stevens, and you are a follower of Allen Ginsberg. And I said,
Allen Ginsberg is the first thing that comes to mind when I hear your work.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I thought, my God, this poor man, what is he afraid of in the dark of night, you know? Gregory. I think the distinction, that curious binary, comes from a gross oversimplification.
But are there different tendencies
And I
that you
feel
feel?
no shame either.
But do you feel that there are approaches to poetry which are entirely different than that which you care about, that remain a kind of dividing point within poetry now?
I don't know. I mean, there's certainly a certain kind of rigorous Anglo-formalism that is still alive and will always be alive. They can be practiced well or can be practiced pathetically badly. Among the English, for example, the notions of traditional form have a cultural inherence and depth that they don't quite have here for us. And I can see a traditional formalism being very powerful if you are not simply writing imitation 19th century romantic verse or what have you, which many practitioners are, and thinking they're validated by the fact that they can do a pentameter. Any moron can do a pentameter, I can tap it out with my feet. Sure, but that divide, that would be interesting to engage some of the more radical Cambridge poets, for example, who are surrounded by English traditionalism in that conversation as well. It's not, I don't think it's quite the argument that it once was in our culture.
In one of your more recent essays, collected anyway in your essay collection, you distinguish invention from discovery. It could be understood as something like process versus craft. Dewey, of course, was a presiding figure, art as process, for the generation older than us.
Yeah.
What do you mean by the distinction between invention versus discovery? I mean, you're critical of invention in that moment as something that's contrived rather than discovery that's something that's not.
That's exactly what I meant. I mean, to rely on a certain clever inventiveness and foregrounding cleverness and artifice of a certain kind was always a problem for me, whereas discovery was why I wrote, to find out things that might not look very clever at all by the time they get onto the page, but to learn something new. It seemed to me deeper. Now, it could be argued that a level of invention, so to speak, is necessary to the act of discovery as well. I don't gainsay that, but I think what I meant to say then was that people who are enamored of inventiveness, of cleverness, can end up with results that seem painfully contrived.
At one point, you write about poetry and translation, an issue you could talk about in other contexts, but to say that all poetry is translation. Mm-hmm. What is your sense of, not of translation as translating Immanuel Hakkard into English or your work being translated into Russian, but the metaphor of poetry as a kind of poetic practice for you?
Well, I mean, poetry is a kind of, if we go back to the literal meaning of translatio, of being bearing a cross, certainly that is central to, I don't mean from a divine dimension, but something is borne across from one territory into another. There's an act of discovery. And that act is, in an almost physical sense, an active traversing of a territory. And so a translatio is a bearing across from, let's say, the world of the absolutely ordinary to what occurs in the poem, which may use ordinary language, paradoxically, but which has become not an ordinary thing. The problem of much standard verse that is absolutely given over to ordinary language. The Ted Kooser school of, regionalism is that there's nothing happening. There is no translation, there is no voyage involved. There are little stories being told at the end of which, as an audience, we're supposed to say, "Ooh, that's sweet." I never thought about the laundry on the line that way before. There's
the way it blows in the wind.
That's it. Yeah.
You know, just when the sun is coming down.
Exactly.
With the checkered patterns.
Yeah.
Very beautiful.
Yeah. Very nice. Yeah. Sunset. So there's no going from one place to another. There's going from the predictable to the expected to the predictable, or what have you. It's in an inertness, which it's an old story, of course.
There's so many poets that I could ask you about, and that you've talked about, but I'm thinking of one that you talked about less, but that is a person increasingly central to me. Now, you mentioned a number of Russian poets, mutual friends of ours, especially Arkady Dragomoshenko, who I loved so much, as you did. But Kevin Platt, who's here in the Kelly Writers House now, reminds me of an event that we did for Alexi Karpov. Now, I knew Alexi Karpov a little bit, but not as well as I would like, and I was really overwhelmed by the work of his that I read after he died. I'd read some of it, but you go back early with him, translating the work. So I just thought, talk about Alexi Karpov, his work, and how you got to know him, something that you could say about what interested you about the quality of that work, because it certainly seems the opposite of anything that you could expect to see in a given poem. It's creating something that's
meta realism.
Well, meta realism is a possible.
There's a certain curious ineffability about his work. It's almost, first of all, there's a certain Baroque character to his thought, and maybe to his language as well, and deliberately so. He would take what was before him and see another reality within it that didn't discard the initial reality, but was so resonant with an echoic space, historical as well as immediate, historical as well as physical. So he would travel across dimensions in a way. This may sound silly, but it was this way even when he would speak about his poetry, and he could start by opening a refrigerator. It could start anywhere, and the medium of the language would allow him to take that voyage in a way that was singular in his work. I don't know of anyone who was quite like him. Obviously, the meta realists and so on had in common a sense of an intensity of almost, if you will, visionary engagement with the real. But his formal sensibility and metaphoric sensibility was unique in a way. Very, very difficult to translate. And I don't think I did that good a job, but I did the best that could be done at the time. And it was better than some of the awful translations that had happened. So I wouldn't be the ideal person by any means to be working on it. But I was very sympathetic. His whole being was engaged with what he saw and heard. It wasn't a kind of avocation or something he did on weekends. It was everything to him. And this, I think, got him into trouble at Stanford, for example, where it was a thing you studied. No, well, it wasn't a thing he studied. It was a thing he embodied in a certain sense. So they thought he was crazy. And he may have been, also in any standard terms. But the thing that was wonderful in working on his work, to be serious for a moment, is that I would go to work on his poems, and I would get insofar as you could get literal meanings, and that was limited in itself, but you could get a certain amount of literalism in the context of these figures he built up. And if you worked on it long enough, and this is true of people who really were bilingual too, unlike me, the poem at some point would open up, and you would sit there in front of it and say, "Oh, I think I've gotten into it. I think I see it now." But for him, it wasn't a poem unless that was the process. If you just read the poem and got it, he wouldn't have been his poem. So you had to take this trip. And I would ask him, well, this word has 4 different meanings in Russian. And could we narrow it down a little bit to a couple? And he would say, "Let me tell you a story." And he would tell a story, which was almost as opaque as the poem. And at the end of that, you were supposed to decide whether that word meant cadmium, yellow, or banana. But it was rewarding at the end. And again, I say there was so much that you miss in trying to do the work that I'm certainly there's someone who will come along to do a much better job. Already are people, I'm sure. But it was a great process. It was fascinating.
You have been hearing Michael Palmer on Penn Sounds. Close listening. The program was recorded on March 13th before a mostly live audience at the Kelly Writers House at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm Charles Bernstein. Close listening, even when it hurts.